The Rules Committee will come to order. Well, we have a busy agenda today, and I will discuss the measures here in order that they will be considered. First, we will consider Hres 908. I have been appalled to see how some, including this president, have referred to the coronavirus by offensive names that I'm not going to repeat here. This president apparently couldn't be bothered to tell the truth to the American people when the pandemic hit, but he jumped at the chance to use this virus to spread vile rhetoric. We have seen since a dramatic spike in hate crimes, violence, and harassment against Asian Americans, and it's disgusting. Look, nearly 200,000 Americans have lost their lives because of the coronavirus. Hundreds of thousands more have been sick and suffered as a result. Many lives that have been lost, and many of the frontline workers and the first responders who have saved the lives have been Asian Americans. Behind me is a new piece of artwork inspired by an 1830 painting called Liberty Leading the People. You may recognize it because it's on the July cover of Rolling Stone magazine. The artist who painted it, Kadir Nelson, said that he created it because he wanted everyone to know that they matter. And I look forward to when we're all meeting in person, when I will display this picture behind the chairman's seat. But that's what this is really all about. As elected officials, we have a responsibility not to pour gasoline on the fire, but to condemn these types of attacks and defend our fellow Americans. Every life matters, and our diversity strengthens this nation. No one should use this virus as a way to traffic xenophobia. Second, we will consider H.R. 2574. It has been more than 65 years since the Supreme Court made racial segregation in public education illegal. But millions of children are going back to school this year in a system that is more racially and socioeconomically segregated than it has been in decades. This is a problem that's getting worse, not better. This bill will combat this, and it will protect the rights of students, parents, and their communities to address racial inequalities in public education. Third, H.R. 2639 will support communities in developing and implementing diversity initiatives that reduce racial prejudice, and it gives them tools to expand what works. And lastly, we will consider H.R. 2694, a simple bill that would solve a very serious problem. Despite Congress having passed a law in 1978 outlawing pregnancy discrimination, we have seen countless examples of employers firing or otherwise discriminating against pregnant workers. This is what it looks like. Instead of giving a pregnant store clerk access to a stool or water, the employer points to the employee's handbook to justify saying, "You're fired." Instead of management engaging with the pregnant worker to ensure that the worker and her growing baby are safe and are following doctor's orders, the manager says, "You're fired." This is an issue that impacts every single community. A constituent of mine, Alejandra Duarte, has been leading a years-long effort to get a bill passed on this very matter on a state level after she was not given proper accommodations while pregnant and later had a stillborn baby. It's just heartbreaking, and I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record an article that appeared in the Worcester Telegram and Gazette, which describes her situation. So imagine being pregnant and hearing "you're fired" when you know that a simple, reasonable accommodation like a chair or a bottle of water could keep you working, contributing to the business, and collecting a paycheck. There's no dignity or fairness in that. Thankfully, this bill will end that practice. Because of this legislation, no pregnant worker will lose their paycheck when a reasonable accommodation is available. So I'm proud to have been an original co-sponsor of this bill since it was first introduced in 2012, and I look forward to supporting it today at Rules and on the floor. Before I turn to our witnesses, I'm going to turn to Mr. Cole, but I think he needs a minute because he's having like a technical difficulty here. So
yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah. You need more time.
I don't know if we need, can you see me?
I know I can't.
Yeah, I can talk, but I can't be seen. That's probably a good thing, by the way, Mr. Chairman. Hang on.
Okay.
There, I think we're, we okay now?
I can see and I can hear you. So now you froze. Well, now we lost you. We're just gonna all be a little patient here until Mr. Cole can work out his technical difficulty. It shouldn't take more than a couple of minutes. But in the meantime, it's good to see everybody.
I think if you tell him to unmute his video and his audio, that might solve the problem.
Yeah, I think he knows that. Yeah, so I think there may be another issue here. So we'll just, but yeah, yeah. So yeah, his staff director just told us it's a more complicated issue, but it should be resolved in a couple of minutes. So if everybody could just hold tight, then we can begin.
Okay, can you hear us now, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you again. Let me just, the two bills I'll pick up a little bit before where I left off. The two bills I'll discuss first seek to address the diversity and inclusion in education. HR 2639, the Strength and Diversity Act, provides grants to schools and school districts to develop or implement plans to improve diversity. And HR 2574, the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act, adds a private act of right of action or the ability for private litigants to bring lawsuits for disparate impact claims under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It also requires recipients of federal education funds to designate a coordinator for compliance efforts for civil rights laws. When considering these two bills, the best I can say for both is that they represent another missed opportunity for bipartisanship. Both Republicans and Democrats in the House already agree that enforcing the Civil Rights Bill and embracing our diversity as a nation are important goals as foundational as the great American principle of equality. Unfortunately, instead of trying to work together, the majorities decided to sow division and bring up two partisan bills that stand no chance of becoming law. It's unfortunate, Mr. Chairman, that this is once again the case. I keep hoping that we will see more bipartisanship from the majority, particularly on issues of such great importance to the country. Our third bill is HR 2694, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, and thankfully this bill actually was the subject of real negotiation between Democrats and Republicans. In fact, my understanding from Ranking Member Fox is that this bill is mostly bipartisan, and the only item the committee could not come to an agreement on was the inclusion of an exemption for religious organizations. I think it's a great sign for this bill that the two sides were able to come to an agreement on all but one point. And I would strongly support the committee providing a rule that allows for a vote on that particular point on the floor so that all members of the House have the opportunity to weigh in on this issue. Regardless, I commend both Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Fox for their hard work on this bill. And while it's unfortunate they were unable to come to a final agreement, I think we should recognize their efforts made to resolve things prior to consideration by the House. Finally, the non-binding House Resolution 908 condemns all forms of anti-Asian sentiment related to the COVID-19 pandemic. While I think every member of the House agrees with the general sentiment of this resolution, I will point out that the House is missing an opportunity by spending time on a non-binding resolution that is clearly just another anti-President Trump message rather than considering legislation that will actually help people, particularly Asian Americans. We're within 2 weeks of the government funding expiring, and the American people continue to struggle with the simultaneous economic downturn and pandemic. If the majority truly wants to help people, we should put forward a substantive bipartisan piece of legislation that provides real solutions for Americans. Unfortunately, it's instead become standard operating procedure for my Democratic colleagues to simply pull out the same old playbook and resort to messaging documents against the president. Mr. Chairman, at some point, the majority must decide if it wants to only score political points or if it wants to truly govern. I fear that resolutions like this show exactly where the majority's priorities lie, and sadly, it's not in providing real solutions for the American people. With that, Mr. Chairman, and with my apologies for the technical difficulties, I yield back.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate your remarks. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on Hres 908, condemning all forms of anti-Asian sentiment as related to COVID-19, HR 2574, the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act, HR 2639, the Strength and Diversity Act, and HR 2694, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. Chairman Nadler and Ranking Member Jordan, Chairman Scott, and Ranking Member Fox, we're delighted that you're here. Without objection, any written materials that you submit to rules.documents@mail.house.gov before the conclusion of this hearing will be entered into the record. I would now like to recognize the distinguished gentleman from New York, Chairman Nadler.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman Govern and Ranking Member Cole, for allowing me to testify about these two critical bills, HR 2694, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which I introduced some years ago, and Hres 908, a resolution condemning anti-Asian discrimination, introduced by Representative Grace Meng of New York. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the need to pass both these measures, and I am proud the House will have the opportunity to vote on them this week. Turning first to Hres 908, a resolution condemning all forms of anti-Asian sentiment as related to COVID-19. Among other things, the resolution introduced by my colleague from New York, Representative Meng, calls upon all public officials to condemn and denounce anti-Asian sentiment, and it calls on federal law enforcement officials to investigate and document all credible reports of hate crimes against Asian Americans, to collect data on the rise of hate crimes incidents due to COVID-19, and to hold perpetrators accountable. The COVID-19 pandemic is an ongoing crisis for our country. Over 6.6 million Americans have been infected, and almost 200,000 have died from COVID-19. It has upended the lives of almost every American in some way, and it will continue to do so for some time as we brace for a second wave of infections. On top of bearing the burdens that the pandemic has imposed on all Americans, Asian Americans have been forced to carry the added anxiety of confronting racial prejudice, including racially motivated harassment and violence stemming from a stigma that has unfairly associated them with COVID-19 because of the virus's origins in China, a stigma that has been reinforced by rhetoric suggesting such a link. According to the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, since March 19th, there have been 2,583 cases of anti-Asian discrimination related to COVID-19. According to the resolution, at the pandemic's earliest stage in this country, between February 9th and March 7th, there were over 400 such incidents. These include the stabbings of an Asian American father and his two young children, ages 2 and 6, in Texas. Public health entities, including the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, have recognized that labeling a virus by geographic or ethnic terms unfairly stigmatizes certain communities and ultimately harms public health. For this reason, Secretary of Health and Human Services Alex Azar rightly condemned the use of the phrase Chinese virus in testimony before the Ways and Means Committee, stating that, quote, ethnicity is not what causes the novel coronavirus, unquote. It is incumbent on all public figures, including elected officials like us, to publicly condemn bigotry and the stigmatization of racial or ethnic groups unfairly targeted for blame. We must speak out clearly against such attitudes and acts of hate wherever they occur, but particularly in the face of public panic or fear during a national emergency, when society can be especially vulnerable to racist appeals and prejudices. While many public figures have admirably sought to end COVID-19 related racial animosity, Some, unfortunately, appear not to share the same sense of moral duty. Rather than using their bully pulpits to confront prejudice and racial hatred, they have instead chosen repeatedly to label COVID-19 as the Chinese virus or Kung flu, reinforcing the exclusion and stigmatization of Asian Americans in the face of national crisis, a tactic that sadly has a long and ugly history in our country. Left unchecked, this type of rhetoric has in the past led to grave injustices like the Chinese Exclusion Act and the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. In the year 2020, condemning bigotry and racial scapegoating should not be hard for any member of this House to do. It is long past time to leave the days of yellow peril hysteria and unjustified blame of the other behind. The House can take an important step in that direction by passing Hres 908 unanimously. I urge you strongly to support this resolution. Turning now to the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, the bill I first introduced in 2012 and was thrilled to see it pass out of the Education and Labor Committee with bipartisan support earlier this year. I thank Chairman Scott and Chair Bonamici for shepherding the bill to the floor this week. Quite simply, pregnancy is not a disability, but sometimes to stay on the job, even in healthy pregnancies, pregnant workers need a reasonable accommodation from their employer, such as a stool, an extra bathroom break, limiting contact with certain chemicals, or reducing the amount of lifting they do. These accommodations are short in duration and typically cost very little to provide, but they can mean the difference between keeping your health insurance and paycheck or putting your pregnancy at risk. But for as long as women have been in the workforce, instead of being accommodated, they have been fired, passed over for hiring and promotion, had their hours or pay cut back, or been forced to leave out, or been forced to out on leave when they became pregnant or started a family. Those policies have become even more pronounced during the COVID-19 pandemic, as more and more employers have refused to accommodate pregnant workers, firing them or putting them out on unpaid leave rather than finding ways for them to safely return to work. These policies, as they too often do, are falling disproportionately on women of color and low-wage hourly workers who suddenly find themselves without a paycheck, without health insurance, and pregnant in the middle of a global pandemic. That is why we must pass the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act this week. The Pregnant Workers Fairness Act will correct a serious problem with how pregnancy accommodation is treated under current law. Under the 1978 Pregnancy Discrimination Act, if employers treat their non-pregnant employees well, they must treat their pregnant employees well. Of course, the inverse is also true. If you treat your non-pregnant employees terribly, you can treat your pregnant employees terribly too. In the 2015 case of Young versus UPS, the Supreme Court interpreted the PDA to mean that in order to receive an accommodation for her employer, a pregnant worker would have to prove that the employer accommodated non-pregnant workers who were similar in their ability or inability to work. In other words, if an employer gave light duty to a man with a hernia, they would have to give light duty to a pregnant woman. However, that test requires workers to have perfect knowledge of the medical and work histories of every other employee in their workplace and prove discrimination, a nearly impossible test for any worker. To ensure that pregnant workers can stay on the job, we have to move away from a model of proving discrimination and create an affirmative right to accommodation. That is why I introduced the Bipartisan Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. Using the framework and language of the Americans with Disability Act, it requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations to pregnant workers as long as the accommodation does not impose an undue hardship on the employer. These accommodations would be available for pregnancy, childbirth, or related conditions, including lactation. Courts know exactly how to interpret that language. There are 3 decades of ADA case law to guide them. Employers similarly have worked within ADA's requirements for decades and know exactly what their responsibilities will be. But most importantly, women will have the certainty they can excuse me. But most importantly, women will have the certainty that they can safely stay on the job. That is why over 180 organizations have endorsed the legislation, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Women's Law Center, the Society for Human Resource Management, the March of Dimes, and the ACLU. And that is why 30 states, most recently South Carolina, Kentucky, and Tennessee, have passed pregnancy accommodation laws similar to the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. States are realizing that providing reasonable accommodations to pregnant workers helps businesses, helps workers, and helps families. Now Congress has the opportunity to join them and pass the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. And let me just add a comment. There seems to be a misapprehension about this bill in that it was stated that this bill would remove the religious exemptions that certain laws provide. It would not. I want to just clarify, any religious exemption in any law that exists would continue to exist under this law. So that is under this bill. So that is simply a non-issue. And I hope no one is put off by that, because whatever religious exemption exists will continue to exist with this law. I want to thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. I'm now happy to yield to the distinguished gentleman from Ohio, Ranking Member Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to testify today. I want to thank you and the ranking member. My understanding is I'll be talking about HR 2574 and then also House Resolution 908. Let me begin, if I could, Mr. Chairman, with HR 2574. It's not just an education bill. This bill is a radical expansion of civil rights law that the Democrats are trying to move through without anyone noticing. The Judiciary Committee, the committee with jurisdiction over the Civil Rights Act, was deprived of the opportunity to debate and mark up this legislation. Democrats bypassed regular order. This bill has serious problems. First, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act applies to any program or entity that receives federal funding. It's not just education, as I said earlier. It's policing, it's housing, it's healthcare, transportation, agriculture, the environment. It's practically everything the federal government touches. Second, contrary to what our Democrat colleagues say, this bill also does not restore a private right of action. The Supreme Court held in 2001 that Section 602 of Title VI does not and has never authorized a private right of action. We should be honest about what this bill does. Democrats are seeking to create a new private right of action, not restore one. The bill will open the door to activist litigation, will force state and local governments to defend themselves from tenuous claims. The leftist Center for American Progress called Title VI and disparate impact claims, quote, sleeping giant of civil rights laws that are powerful. They are a potentially powerful tool to advance liberal goals through activist litigation. Let's be clear. This bill is a handout to liberal activists who will seek to require state and local governments to adopt a myriad of left-wing policies that Congress and state and local lawmakers never authorized or never intended. We need only look to the Obama-Biden administration to know what will happen if Democrats expand disparate impact claims throughout the government. Tom Hres, current DNC chair, was Secretary of Labor and the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights during the Obama-Biden administration at the Justice Department. Mr. Perez went after banks for not lending enough to minority communities, despite the facts that the banks were making sound lending decisions and denials of credit were based on non-discriminatory factors like income, employment status, and credit history. Imagine that. Nobody should be subjected to discrimination on the basis of their race, color, or national origin. We all agree with that. And they certainly shouldn't be so in federally funded programs. And there is a strong history of bipartisan, bicameral congressional solutions to racial inequalities in education and federal funding. The Democrats were serious about reforming the Civil Rights Act. They would have gone through regular order. The Judiciary Committee would have held hearings, and we would have marked up this legislation. Instead, we didn't. We are left with this partisan bill designed to score political points on this legislation. Now I'd like to turn, Mr. Chairman, if I could, to House Resolution 908. As I said before, no one condones racism or discrimination, but we don't need a House resolution to tell us that. Everyone knows that this is politics 50 days before an election. Democrats are trying to convince the American people that our country is somehow racist. Americans aren't buying it. Actually, it turns out Americans love this country. Americans love America. And they know when the president calls the virus the China virus or the Wuhan virus, that's not racism. That's just the facts. Did this virus start in China? Yes. Did this virus start in Wuhan? Yes. Did the Chinese government lie to the United States about the origins of what was taking place when they first noticed this virus? Yes. Did the Chinese government lie to the world? Yes. Did the World Health Organization lie to the United States about this virus at the urging of China? Yes. And did the World Health Organizations lie to the rest of the world about the origin of this virus? The answer to that question is yes again. But in the cancel culture world of today's left, you can't state the facts. You can't state the facts. Instead, you got to tear down the country. You got to tear down America. In the politically correct world, in the woke world of today's left, it's not about stating the truth. It's not about the facts. It's about attacking American culture. We see this right here in the capital city, where the mayor of this city is actually proposing that we dismantle the Washington Monument and the Jefferson Memorial. Everyone knows when China is referenced, it's not about the Chinese people or about people of Asian descent. It's about the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government. The Chinese government launched a disinformation campaign to cover up its role in exacerbating the spread of COVID-19. The cover-up included punishing doctors, limiting the access of journalists, censoring the internet, spreading disinformation, and withholding information from the international community. For example, despite evidence to the contrary, a Chinese government official publicly and falsely claimed that the U.S. Army brought the virus to Wuhan. The Chinese government's failure to institute a full-scale public response and underreporting of COVID-19 cases and deaths propelled the virus on its deadly course, not just in the United States, but around the world. What we should be doing, Mr. Chairman, we're going to have resolutions. How about a resolution condemning the violence that is happening in our great American cities? How about a resolution condemning what's going on in Florida, or excuse me, in Portland for the past 100+ days? How about a resolution condemning defunding the police policy that the left continues to push? How about a resolution supporting law enforcement personnel? How about a resolution on that? Or how about a resolution condemning the genocide that is actually taking place in China? That's what we should be focusing on. We could get bipartisan support, I think, for at least some of those. Maybe not, but I think we should be trying to do that versus this resolution that's in front of us today. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I am now happy to yield to the gentleman from Virginia, Chairman Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Cole. I'm pleased to speak today on 3 bills: the Strength and Diversity Act, H.R. 2639, the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act, H.R. 2574, and the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act 2694 that the gentleman from New York has already spoken about, so I'll be very brief on that one. First 2 bills, the Strength and Diversity Act and Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act, are part of an historic effort to address the persistent racial inequities in our education system. This would be the first new investment in school integration in more than 3 decades. Just over 66 years ago, the Supreme Court, in the landmark decision, Brown v. Board of Education, ruled that our public schools are need to be desegregated, that segregation in the schools denies the children of the minority race of an equal educational opportunity, and that the GAO just recently issued a report just about 2 years ago that showed that the public schools today are more segregated by race and class today than any time since the 1960s. Now, racial and socioeconomic isolation fuels our nation's academic achievement gap by pushing students of color into under-resourced schools. Schools serving predominantly children of color face a $23 billion racial funding gap compared to schools serving predominantly white students. And as the UC Berkeley Associate Professor Rucker C. Johnson has stated, segregation is not only about separation of people, but it is the hoarding of opportunity. In response, the Strength and Diversity Act, led by Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, provides resources and support for school districts that voluntarily pursue community-driven strategies to promote diversity. Specifically, the legislation updates and codifies the Obama-era grant program, the Opening Doors, Expanding Opportunities, which would have helped districts implement school integration strategies. When that program was launched in 2016, more than 30 districts applied for the money from across the country. Unfortunately, one of Secretary DeVos's first actions in office was to terminate that small program. By offering both grant funding and expertise, the Strength and Diversity Act will give districts the support they need to develop, implement, and expand evidence-based efforts to desegregate their schools. It is important to recognize that school integration in and of itself is not the goal. The goal is equal access to quality education, and school integration is a proven tool for providing more students the resources they need. Now, in Louisville, Kentucky, this is needed because in voluntary programs in Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington, the Supreme Court struck those programs when they had voluntary integration programs, and this grant program will make it possible for localities to get the expertise and technical assistance to draft effective programs that can withstand that constitutional challenge. And we have found that Black students who attended desegregated schools in their K through 12 career are more likely to graduate from high school, more likely to attend college, more likely to attend a selective school, more likely to complete college, and in their working years earn higher wages. There have been a number of thoughtful amendments filed for the Strength and Diversity Act that I believe may improve the underlying legislation, and so I urge you to adopt a structured rule. The second bill, the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act, secures the right of students and parents to address racial inequities in their schools. From the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 to 2001, students and parents did have the right under Title VI to challenge education policies that have a disparate impact on their access to a quality education. Importantly, disparate impact claims do not have to establish that the school acted with intentional bias, which is also often impossible to prove. These claims can only be established. These claims only have to establish that a school policy or practice has a disproportionate negative impact on students of a certain race, color, or national origin. Unfortunately, in 2001, the Supreme Court, on a 5-4 decision in Alexander v. Sandoval, stripped victims of discrimination of their right to bring disparate impact claims under Title VI against schools and other entities receiving federal funds. Under Sandoval, only the federal government may use disparate impact in administrative enforcement in Title VI. If an administration is hostile to federal civil rights law, no such enforcement occurs. Since 2001, many parents and students have expressed confusion and frustration. The law cannot address provable discriminatory effect of certain policies and practices in their communities. The Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act simply restores the right of students and parents, the victims of discrimination, to hold schools accountable for providing all students with equal educational opportunities for quality education. At a time when educational inequity is rapidly growing, both the Strength and Diversity Act and the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act will help ensure that our communities will have what they need to shape the diverse, equitable schools that the children deserve. The third bill, the HR 2694, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, has been described in detail by the gentleman from New York, so I won't go into details on that other than to just acknowledge that it is a bipartisan legislation. So I want to thank Chairman Nadler, Congressman Katko, you, Mr. Chairman, and you, Mr. Cole, and the other 241 co-sponsors who support the effort to ensure that pregnant people are not forced to choose between financial security and a healthy pregnancy. With that, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'm happy now to yield to the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ranking Member Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, thank you for the opportunity to speak on HR 2574, the Equity Inclusion Enforcement Act, HR 2639, the Strength and Diversity Act, and HR 2694, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. Regarding HR 2574, separate is not and never was equal. Racism is wrong, segregation is wrong. While its place in the law is finally over, its lingering effects are not. We know that better integrated schools have academic benefits for all students. Republicans and Democrats largely agree on the importance of equality in integrated schools. Unfortunately, instead of working towards a bipartisan solution, H.R. 2574 is the result of Democrats choosing a partisan path. My colleague from the Judiciary Committee has spoken to these issues better than I, but this bill represents a sweeping change to civil rights law that nobody has debated. That isn't how this Congress should work. Changes to the law do not mean changes to individual hearts and minds, and we know that more work needs to be done to secure the promises of our country for everyone. However, while I appreciate the intentions behind this bill, I have major reservations about its efficacy and the lack of transparency in its consideration. The question is whether in the long run these ideas will have helped or hurt the ongoing effort to achieve greater equality for children. H.R. 2574 fails on this front. Concerning H.R. 2639, the Strength in Diversity Act, Republicans and Democrats agree that discrimination and state-sanctioned segregation are repugnant, illegal, and blatantly immoral. Studies have shown that integrated schools promote greater understanding, tolerance, and improve educational outcomes, particularly for students of color. This topic afforded the committee an opportunity to work across the aisle to find bipartisan compromise. Yet committee Democrats ignored common sense approaches to this problem to impose a top-down big government mandate that would have the federal government decide how best to address the issues of racial and socioeconomic isolation in America's schools. Additional government mandates and burdensome red tape are not the answer. Congress has already set up the student support and academic enrichment grants, a block grant created to give school districts flexibility to pursue local solutions to their community's educational challenges. Local and state leaders and those with their feet on the ground know how best to, instead of building upon a program that is bipartisan, bicameral support, Democrats' H.R. 2639 sets up a new grant program within the Department of Education that will inevitably be underfunded if it's funded at all. That's why I encourage you to support the amendment Representative Allen will offer. The amendment could easily garner an overwhelming majority of votes in the House of Representatives if every member chose to focus on the importance of actually addressing racial and socioeconomic isolation in schools. Representative Allen's amendment would allow school districts to use funds they receive from the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grants Program to develop or implement comprehensive strategies to improve diversity and reduce or eliminate racial or socioeconomic isolation in public early education programs and public schools. This is the type of common sense solutions we need to ensure that discrimination and state-sanctioned segregation have no place in our nation's schools. H.R. 2639 also ignores the biggest problem facing low-income students and students of color, a lack of high-quality educational options. Committee Republicans stand ready to work with our colleagues in the majority to expand educational opportunities to all families. But rather than bring a bill to the floor that would expand the availability of charter schools or offer marginalized families the kind of educational freedom that the wealthy exercise for themselves, Democrats decided teachers' unions are more important to them than real families who are desperate for access to a better education for their children. Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, Republicans want nothing more than to see all American children prosper. That means expanding opportunities for marginalized students to gain access to an education that prepares them for lifelong success. It also means school districts taking action to reduce racial and socioeconomic isolation in schools. A bipartisan path forward to make that possible was achievable, but Democrats would rather score political points than work with Republicans on solutions that will make a significant difference in the lives of our nation's children. Turning to H.R. 2694, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. Education and Labor Committee Republicans have long been committed to policies that empower all Americans to achieve success. Discrimination of any type should not be tolerated, and no one should ever be denied an opportunity because of unlawful discrimination. That is why there are important protections under federal law to prevent workplace discrimination, including federal laws that protect pregnant workers. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act, PDA, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, are examples. These federal laws ensure workers are not being unlawfully discriminated against, as well as that they receive reasonable accommodations related to pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions. However, supporters of H.R. 2694 argue there are cases in which courts have not interpreted the PDA or the ADA as covering certain pregnant workers who are in need of reasonable accommodation. Since its introduction, H.R. 2694 has seen significant improvements as a result of bipartisan negotiations last year. I give credit where credit is due and commend Chairman Scott for his outreach in this regard. H.R. 2694, as introduced, did not require a pregnant worker, in order to be eligible for an accommodation, to be able to perform the essential functions of the job with a reasonable accommodation. This is a sensible provision now included in the bill, with additional language that a temporary limitation which prevents performance of an essential function may qualify for a reasonable accommodation. Further, a definition of, quote, known limitations, end quote, related to pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions was also initially excluded. But the bill now includes such a definition and a requirement that employees communicate the known limitation to the employer. This provision will help workers and their employers understand their rights and responsibilities. Additionally, the original version of H.R. 2694 appeared to allow employees a unilateral veto over offered accommodations. But the bill now clarifies that reasonable accommodations will typically be determined through a balanced and interactive dialogue between workers and employers, similar to the process implemented under the ADA. Finally, the bill now includes a provision ensuring that if an employer makes a good faith effort to determine a reasonable accommodation through the interactive process with the employee, the employer is not liable for damages. Unfortunately, despite agreement on these improvements, one major issue remains to be addressed: providing important current law protections to religious organizations. During the committee markup of this bill, Republicans offered an amendment to include a narrow but long-standing provision from the Civil Rights Act. It is not currently incorporated in the bill. Without this provision, H.R. 2694 could result in religious organizations being denied protections they receive under current law. The provision, which already exists under current law, protects the religious organizations from being forced to make employment decisions that conflict with their faith. Unfortunately, committee Democrats defeated the amendment on a party line vote. The First Amendment guarantees all Americans the freedom of religion. And for over 240 years, Supreme Court decisions and laws written by Congress have maintained strong protections for religious liberty. Not including such a provision in this bill will lead to confusion and legal jeopardy for religious organizations. While we made good progress negotiating on H.R. 2694, the omission of the Civil Rights Act protection will result in this bill dealing an unnecessary blow to religious liberty. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you all very much for your testimony. I appreciate your being part of this hearing. I don't have any questions. I do want to say one thing about Hres 908. I quite frankly, maybe naively, thought that this would be non-controversial, that there'd be no dissent over this. I mean, there's nothing in the resolution that mentions the president by name. And Mr. Jordan mentioned some of the things the president has said, which I think are inappropriate. He omitted some others that are even more inappropriate. But the bottom line is we do know that violence and harassment against Asian Americans is on the rise in this country. Businesses have been vandalized. And a resolution condemning all forms of anti-Asian sentiment as related to COVID-19, that is a point of contention. I mean, look, I have strong disagreements with the president. I'm hoping that some of my Republican friends will appeal to him to have him lower his rhetoric, not only on this, but on a whole range of things, which I think are very divisive. But turning people against one another like this, I don't get it. Maybe just we don't share the same values. I don't know, but this is anyway. I just wanted to state that I have no questions. I now turn to the ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any comments or questions he may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me begin by looking at HR 2574, addressed to my good friend, the ranking member. I'm sure, as you stated quite eloquently in your own testimony, and I think we would all agree with this, regardless of party, discrimination is just simply wrong. It's illegal, it's immoral, it's repugnant. There's no justification for it whatsoever. Having said that, it appears to me HR 2774 is less about eliminating discrimination and more about being a superhighway to litigation in just about every sector of the economy for liberal activists to advance agendas that they couldn't get enacted into law and are unlikely to win easily through the court system. So is that a fair characterization in your opinion?
It is.
Okay, and let me turn now to my good friend, the ranking member, Judiciary, Mr. Jordan. And while I know the Education Labor Committee had a markup of certain portions of HR 2574, your committee, the Judiciary Committee, is actually the committee of principal jurisdiction on this. Did the Judiciary Committee have an opportunity to conduct a markup of this legislation?
We did not. We did not. I mean, highly unusual when you're talking about Civil Rights Act and when you're talking about right action.
And would you support the Judiciary Committee having a markup of this?
Of course.
Legislation?
Of course.
Okay, and to be fair, Chairman Nadler, is there a reason why this particular legislation, that is HR 2574, did not come before your committee, since you're the principal committee of jurisdiction in this area?
No, there's no reason. It just moved through the Education and Labor Committee.
Well, a lot of times it's pretty normal for things to move through multiple committees, particularly the principal committee of jurisdiction. And is there any particular reason why you didn't feel like it was necessary?
We just didn't feel it was necessary. We thought the Education and Labor Committee did an adequate job.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And if I may, now let me move to HR 2639, the Strength and Diversity Act. And to me, it seems like there's a real opportunity here to actually make this bill into one that could be very bipartisan. So before the legislation was scheduled for markup, Ms. Fox, did you have any discussion, negotiation about this at all?
No, there was no effort to engage with us on negotiations.
And do you think if there'd have been such an effort, you might have been able to reach a bipartisan agreement here?
I do. I believe that the majority approached us with a genuine interest in a bipartisan solution. We could have reached an agreement. As I said in my opening statement, Representative Allen submitted an amendment for your consideration that could easily garner bipartisan support if members were truly interested in giving school districts tools to address these problems in their communities.
I would be remiss not to thank both Chairman Scott and you on the issue related to pregnancy disability. You guys worked really hard and came very close there. And I just go on record of supporting your suggestion if we just have one item placed for a vote, because I intend to support the legislation regardless, but I think we ought to have that vote. But again, I want to thank both of you for that. Let me move quickly now, if I may, to HR 908. And I want to begin by actually associating myself with Chairman McGovern's remarks. I don't find any problem with the language, actually more disappointed about what's not in the bill or in the resolution, excuse me, than what's in the bill. Chairman Nadler, it's my understanding there's a lack of disaggregated data on Asian Americans, which makes it actually very challenging to assess the health impact of COVID-19 on that population. Do you agree with that? And are there any provisions in Hres 908 that might help us deal with that issue?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand your question. There's nothing in the bill.
No, it's not aimed at the resolution itself in terms of what's in it. It's just a question. One of the problems we have in assessing the impact of COVID-19 on the Asian population is that we don't have much disaggregated data that we should have. We should do better at this, quite frankly. I'm just curious if there's.
I would agree with that. We could do better on getting more disaggregated data.
Okay. And there was actually a recent study by McKinsey Company that found that many Asian Americans are unable to fully participate in relief programs from the SBA due to translation limitations. And again, I suspect you would agree with that. Is there anything in the resolution that deals with that?
No, but I would agree with it. We could do that.
Okay. And so again, I just make this, there's also information out there about the Asian communities' inability in many cases to access the Paycheck Protection Program. Been pretty critical. It's been a very popular bipartisan effort in helping small businesses across the board. But again, nothing in this resolution particularly deals with that. Is that the case?
Yeah, this is about discrimination, and that's one of the problems we can certainly address.
Yeah. Well, again, look, I find the resolution unobjectionable. I just wish we would have done a little bit more here, because I think there's actually, as the questions show, and you and I don't disagree on this.
No, we don't.
There's certainly some areas here that we could agree to work on together, and maybe we can do that in a subsequent piece of legislation. So that's the only point I wish to make. Certainly have no objection to the sentiment itself. Just if we work together a little bit more, maybe we can actually improve this in a way that both parties would be very proud of, and I think would serve the Asian American community very well.
Sure.
So, well, thank you for your work, and thank all of you for appearing. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Torres. All right, I don't see Ms. Torres, so I'm going to go to Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. A couple things. With respect to 2574, the reasonable accommodation for pregnancies, I just would ask the chair and the chairs and ranking members of these two committees. Some young new mothers have approached me recently concerned about postpartum. And it isn't just up to the moment of birth that the mothers may have issues. Postpartum seems to be something else that I think, just as a general principle, we need to be concerned about. So that's just more of as you're doing more with these bills, this subject, please take a good look at postpartum issues, blood pressure issues, because the impact of the pregnancy doesn't end with birth. That's all. That's what I've been told, obviously.
Good point. Good point.
That's number one. Number two, as to 908, Just a couple quotes I'd like to read from the president back in February, and then some numbers, because Mr. Jordan mentioned some other things he'd like to see a resolution about. I guess I would as well. Not on February 7th, the president is quoted as having said, "Just had a long and very good conversation by phone with President Xi of China. He is strong, sharp, and powerfully focused on leading the counterattack on the coronavirus. He feels they are doing very well, even building hospitals in a matter of days. Great discipline is taking place in China as President Xi strongly leads what will be a very successful operation. We are working closely with China to help." And then he has a number of other quotes throughout February, but I'll go to one on February 26th. "China is working very, very hard. I have spoken to President Xi and they're working very hard. And if you know anything about him, I think he'll be in pretty good shape. They've had a rough patch, and I think right now they have it. It looks like they're getting it under control more and more. They're getting it more and more under control." And then on the 29th, he says, "China seems to be making tremendous progress. Their numbers are way down. I think our relationship with China is very good. You just did a big trade deal. We're starting on another trade deal with China, a very big one. And we've been working very closely. They've been talking to our people. We've been talking to their people, having to do with the virus." So there was a lot of conversations going on between President Trump and President Xi back in February. And at that point, it seemed like he was pretty impressed with China's response to the virus. And actually, if you look today, China has had 4,734 deaths from the virus. United States, 194,071. South Korea, about the same time in early March of this year, was at about 30 deaths. United States was about at 30 deaths. South Korea today, smaller country, obviously, 50 million people. They're at 363, and we're at 194,000. We're losing 800 to 1,000 people a day. Right now, on average, in China and South Korea, it's one or less. So I support the resolution 908, and I would support a resolution condemning the abysmal response of this administration to the coronavirus, the deadly attack on Americans. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, we can't hear you. Mr. Woodall?
Let me break in for a moment at this point with reference to what Ed Perlmutter said a few minutes ago with the Pregnancy Disability Bill, with the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. I just want to point out that the bill by its terms covers pregnancy, childbirth, and related medical conditions. So it does cover what Congressman Perlmutter was concerned about, because by its conditions, by its terms, the bill covers pregnancy, childbirth, and related medical conditions, and therefore covers what Ed was concerned about.
Thank you.
So we're going to Mr. Woodall. I know he has a little bit of a technical difficulty, so he's just getting hooked up.
Am I back in with you, Mr. Chairman?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Well, I thank you so much. I want you to
I can
know it
see you,
affirms
too.
me It wasn't that you didn't want to hear me, it was that you were unable to hear me, and I appreciate you making that distinction.
I hang on every one of your words, you know that.
I wanted to ask, as I often do, about our ability to yank what is supposed to be a bipartisan partnership bill and turn it into something that seems to divide us instead of unite us. I'll start with Ranking Member Fox. I, as a Georgian, obviously support Mr. Allen's ability to bring his substitute to the floor. Did you all have a chance to vote on that substitute in committee?
Representative Allen. Representative Allen submitted an amendment for consideration here that could easily, we think, garner bipartisan support, and we hope that the Rules Committee will make that in order.
Chairman Scott, thinking about that, I know you would not presume to speak for the 13 members of the Rules Committee, but given your understanding of the Allen Amendment and the language that you all brought out of committee, do you have any objection to the Allen language? Is it going to thwart any sort of delicate compromise that you have already crafted?
Mr. Chairman, there's a bad echo.
Could everybody who's not Mr. Woodall or who's answering the question, please mute their screen so that we don't hear the echo?
I had turned that feature on for emphasis, Mr. Chairman. I'll turn that off. Mr. Scott, my question was whether or not the Allen Amendment, as you understand it, would thwart some sort of delicate compromise that you had crafted in order to move this legislation forward, or would you have no objection to allowing the House to work its will on that amendment on the floor?
Yeah, I'm not particular about the amendment, but I understand that you're going to have some amendments to on the legislation on a structured bill, so we'll have the opportunity to address them on the floor.
I very much appreciate that. I wanted to ask Chairman Nadler, you made it very clear that nothing in the Pregnancy Workers Protection Act altered current law as it related to religious exemptions. Of course, that's true. It's crafting new law. My question is, again, we have so many opportunities for partnership here. Time and time again, we come together in bipartisan ways to protect religious freedoms. What was the harm as you saw it? What led to the defeat of offering what I would call standard religious protections as an addition to this bill that exist in so many other bills that Congress passes and presidents of both parties sign?
Well, it's not a question of defeating. It was lack of necessity. This bill does not eliminate the religious exemptions that exist, and therefore there's no point to having language that says it doesn't do what it doesn't do.
So understanding that folks very honestly have those concerns, that amendment wasn't offered in committee to be dilatory. It was a sincere member's a concern. Because you find it to be duplicative, you would be opposed to it being included. Is that my understanding?
Essentially, yes, it is duplicative because it doesn't do anything, because the bill does not eliminate the religious exemptions in any way.
Well, actually, it's more than duplicative, because it may be over-inclusive, because some people may have a religious exemption to the person being pregnant.
I understand that distinction, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask the ranking member again. It has been frustrating to me. The hardest issues that come through Congress, and yet time and time again, the hard issues that come through Congress, getting civil liberties just right in civil rights legislation, getting an impeachment of the president. All of these big issues seem to be bypassing the Judiciary Committee instead of coming right through the heart of it. On this issue, religious liberties is squarely within the jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee. Could you speak, Mr. Jordan, to the concerns that members had, not that they needed to engage in something duplicative, but that they needed to ensure that, again, something that we all agree on, we need to protect the rights of pregnant workers and do so in the tried and true path that also protects the rights of the religious liberties of the others involved.
Of course, it's the first thing mentioned in the First Amendment. I mean, you talk about the privileges we have, your right to practice your faith, your right to assemble, your right to petition your government, freedom of the press, freedom to speak. I mean, it's one of those fundamental liberties mentioned in the very First Amendment. So of course, it would make sense to just make sure we are protecting this fundamental liberty.
Mr. Woodall, may I respond to that also?
Yeah, absolutely, Ms. Fox.
Well, I can't get it unmuted. Okay, now I think it's unmuting. You know, this protection for religious organizations and Civil Rights Act has been federal law for more than 55 years. It's a very limited but long-standing protection. It's not a license to discriminate. It merely allows a religious organization to make religiously based employment decisions. Although H.R. 2694 references several sections of the Civil Rights Act, it does not incorporate Section 702. I see no reason why we should not do that. I don't believe that's duplicative. What this oversight could do is create a conflict between H.R. 2694 and the Civil Rights Act and put religious organizations in legal jeopardy for making certain employment-related decisions. Unfortunately, H.R. 2694 excludes the narrow religious organization protection found in the Civil Rights Act. All we need is a simple reference to Section 702 of the Civil Rights Act, and we could eliminate this conflict and ensure that religious organizations receive the same protections they're offered in the Civil Rights Act. And we could have a bipartisan bill. That would also make sure that 2694 is consistent with current law protections for religious organizations. So I think it should be there.
Mr. Jordan?
And think about the context. Think about where we're at. For months, Americans have been denied their right to go practice their faith as they want on Sunday morning at their church. Even today in the state of California, the government system is preventing churches from meeting. There were people cited for even wanting to have a drive-in service. So in that context, your point is all the more important that we make sure we do this appropriately, we do this fairly, we do this consistently, we do this in a way that fully respects the First Amendment.
Yeah, particularly in times of uncertainty, I think it's important that the House speak with a single voice, and this does seem like an incredibly easy way to bring us together. As Ms. Fox referenced, this is something we've been doing together for 5 decades, both recognizing the civil rights of Americans who are employers and those who are employees. And with your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, I don't want to speak for the first time since coming back without recognizing Mr. Tom Wickham's announced retirement. I think about all the things that do bring us together as an institution, all of the work that goes on behind the scenes to make sure that we earn every day the trust of the American people by having a process that's fair. There are winners and there are losers. But the process matters. There are, of course, it's an amazing team that works with Mr. Wickham, and the House will continue to be well served by that amazing team. But it is always a loss, particularly to this committee, when someone who loves this institution, when someone who has served this institution with the kind of integrity that we would all want we would ask it of ourselves, and we would ask it of those others who have the privilege of serving beside us. when they decide that it's time to seek that next chapter. So I know my colleagues may have had a lot of press coming across their desk while we were away, but with Mr. Wickham's announcement of his departure fell heavy on me, because I count on this committee to protect the institution from the winds of change that can blow us in wayward directions, and I count on the parliamentarians' office, and I thank Tom for his service there. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your generous words about Tom Wickham. We're all going to miss him. Especially in this committee, we rely on the parliamentarian's office quite extensively, as do all committees, quite frankly. And Jason Smith, who has been his deputy, will do an incredible job as well. But the parliamentarian's office is a very unique, has a very unique role here, and that is that they are truly nonpartisan, and they call them as they see them. And so, but Tom has served this, not only this Congress, but this country with great distinction. And I think we'll find an opportunity to be able to talk more extensively about that. But thank you for your words. I now want to turn to Ms. Scanlon.
I'm fine. You can move to the next member.
Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a couple questions. The first one is for Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan, thank you for pointing out that the virus actually did occur and take place, started in China, and that China was not forthcoming with the information. Remind me, do you remember when President Trump did the ban on travel from China? And were the Democrats and Joe Biden and Pelosi opposed to that ban of travel from China?
The answer to a lot of questions is yes. The answer to the former is I don't know the exact date, but it was early on where the President of the United States took decisive action and said we're going to prevent travel from China into the United States very early on. And I think Mr. Biden said it called that xenophobic. I think Speaker Pelosi said that it was, it's fine and nothing to worry about. Come to the festival that was happening that very weekend in San Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. And on that particular bill, I just want to say to my colleagues that just because you call something a Chinese virus, I don't think that's discriminatory against Chinese people. It's just saying that's where it originated in China. And so I just disagree with the premise that calling it a Chinese virus is discriminatory against Asian Americans. I just don't agree with that. And as is evident actually in Arizona, we have a large Asian American community in Arizona, and a lot of them support President Trump. And so if this was so discriminatory, you would think that they wouldn't, but they do. And I just disagree with the premise of it, quite frankly. I do have a question for either Mr. Jordan or Representative Fox on this whole religious exemption in the other bill that we're talking about, protecting pregnant women. At the face of it, I feel supportive of this bill, but I'm trying to understand what religion, like what circumstance there would be a problem. Like my religion, Christian religion, we support pregnant women. I mean, we're pro-life. So what religion wouldn't support pregnant women? I guess I don't understand.
Well, I don't know any religion that wouldn't protect pregnant women. I think in this day and time, we all understand what the continuation of the human race depends upon. I think human beings have understood that for a long time. And so if you want your groups to continue, then you want to support pregnant women. So I can't imagine that that's going to happen. And I agree with you. I think it is primarily religious organizations we are anti-abortion. Religious people are anti-abortion. So we want to protect both the unborn child as well as the mother. And we talk all the time about the terrible ramifications of abortion to pregnant women in the long-term effects. And so we want to protect pregnant women and their unborn children.
Well, maybe I'll talk to you offline because I'm just trying to understand in which situation there would be a religion that's not going to be supportive of pregnant women.
And let me point out that we already have the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, the PDA. We have the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. I know the ADA was passed by Republicans, and I suspect the Pregnancy Discrimination Act was too. And so we already have law, but those two bills account for religious exemptions. It is passing strange that the chairman of the Judiciary Committee does not want to have a very simple reference to Section 702, which would remove any doubt as to whether there is a bona fide religious exemption.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the gentlelady's comments. Let me just again say, the president's characterization of this virus as a China virus is one of many characterizations that he uses. Some I'm not going to repeat here today. And I have members of my Asian American community asking me why would he use that kind of language, which they view as encouraging discrimination, stigmatizing an entire community. So look, you can say that this is nothing, but I assure the gentlelady that there are many, not only in my district, but across the country, who are deeply offended by that language. And all we are saying, and again, we're not even mentioning the president by name, is that during this very challenging time when we're trying to get this virus under control, by the way, as Mr. Perlmutter pointed out, we're getting close to 200,000 dead in our country. And for some reason, there are some who say that's a success. It is a failure, no matter how you look at it. But the bottom line is, as we're trying to deal with this, let's not continue to divide our country. Now yield to Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by thanking my good friend and the chairman of the Ed and Labor Committee for the bills in front of us, as well as the longtime friend of mine, the chair of the Judiciary Committee, who hails from New York. So I want to thank them on the substance of the bills, and I was proud to remember the Ed and Labor Committee to participate in the markup on the resolutions before us. I hesitate to say something, and I was thinking as Mr. Perlmutter, my dear friend, was offering his comments that I would like to associate myself with. And all of the praise heaped on President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party, as Mr. Jordan would put it, since they're the party in charge and they're the government, and the president had no shortage of support for them and praise for them. And since the term China virus has been brought up, I find it somewhat curious that the use of the phrase has only come about once the president has decided it's in his political interests to suddenly be at odds with President Xi. And therein, I think, also lies the conversation about the campaign that we observe going on in the United States right now. I find it also curious and passing strange, to use a phrase that my good friend, the ranking member, used, Ms. Fox, that if the president were so confident in his response to the virus and so confident that the American public was so supportive of his response to this virus, I think you'd be hearing a lot about the virus on the trail, so to speak, in the conversations each night instead of all the distractions that go on. I think the fact is the president knows his response has been abysmal. I think he knows that his response that has left now quickly approaching 200 1,000 Americans dead. I think they understand the response has been something that the American public has found quite wanting, and all you have to do is watch rallies on TV each night to get a sense for where the president's head is on this. This has been an incredibly poor showing. I think it's historic in its ineptness, and I didn't want to raise this in the context of the resolution we have in front of the House, but I did feel compelled to offer some commentary on it since it seems to be much part of the conversation. With that, Mr. Chair, I will yield the floor back.
Mr. Chairman, could I respond? Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Shalala.
Mr. Chairman, could I
Oh,
respond?
I'm sorry. Yes.
Mr. Jordan here.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Jordan, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just find it interesting that you said just not too long ago that the House Resolution 908 wasn't about the president, and yet that's all you guys have talked about. Mr. Nadler, I didn't bring up the president. Mr. Nadler did in his opening comments. So for the resolution that you said was so wonderful and we'd all support it, it's not about the president, every single Democrat has talked about it and criticized the president. So again, which way is it? What we do know is what Ms. Lesko said. This virus started in China. China lied to us and to the world. China had the World Health Organization lie to them. This president took decisive action early on, and yet you guys, all you want to talk about is you want to go up to the president, even though you said at the start that this resolution was not about the president.
I guess what I should say and make it very clear, this is about our values, and whether or not we're going to disparage a community, I guess for political gain, no matter who it is. But I think this is about our values.
The president's been very clear about not disparaging any community.
People
about
can
pointing
make
out where the virus started.
Yeah, people can make their own mind up. I think this is about our values, and I hope that this gets a strong bipartisan vote. Ms. Shalala.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm surprised that this simple resolution is evoking so much comment. It seems to me that most of us know that discrimination against Asian Americans has existed since the middle of the 19th century. They've been accused of all sorts of things, particularly during healthcare scares. And the Congress even passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is a stain on our country's history. So I strongly support condemning all forms of anti-Asian settlement, particularly as it relates to COVID-19. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I'm trying. Is Mr. Raskin on the?
Yes.
Do you have any questions, Mr. Raskin, or are you all set?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to speak very strongly for the resolution condemning anti-Asian bigotry and violence. There's been a wave of it across the country in the wake of COVID-19 and the absurd efforts to blame Asian American people for COVID-19. And we've seen way too many episodes of appalling violence, bigotry, harassment take place. And, I'm surprised to hear colleagues go back now to this old, absurd and empty diversionary tactic of saying the president of the United States is not responsible for the public health of people in the United States. It's the Chinese government. And the Chinese government is at fault for the fact that we lead the world in case count. We lead the world in death count. We are #1 in COVID-19 because of the lethal incompetence of this administration. So they want to point the finger at China. I refer them to the 37 documented cases we have of President Trump defending the Chinese government and defending the Chinese Communist Party against the charge that they had done anything wrong, and him saying, no, we've got a great relationship. They're my great friends. This is not just January and February, but March and April. The president, for 4 months at the beginning of the year, through the whole beginning of the crisis, was defending his great friends in the Chinese government. So this is not a question about government. This is a question about violence against American citizens or non-citizens who are in our country right now. And I would hope that there would be unanimous bipartisan support for this resolution to deplore that kind of violence, which is so antithetical to the best traditions of our country and everything we're fighting to become as a nation. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Did I miss anybody on the rules panel who has not been recognized? I'm just trying to go by what I see here. Any other?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Cole.
Before, I just would ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a statement of administration policy on HR 2574, which states should the legislation be passed as written and reach the president's desk, his advisors would recommend a veto.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'll just ask one more time before I dismiss the panel. Anybody else have any questions? Seeing and hearing none, I would like to thank our witnesses for their testimony. You are now excused. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Let me also ask, are there any other members who wish to testify on Hres 908, HR 2574, HR 2639, or HR 2694? Seeing none or hearing none on these four pieces of legislation, this closes the hearing on these matters. Okay. And I think now the chair will be in receipt of a motion from the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon.
Hi, thank you. Juggling two things. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee to grant HR 2574, the Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act, a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Education and Labor. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Education and Labor, now printed in the bill, modified by the amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. The rule provides for consideration of HR 2369, the Strength and Diversity Act of 2020, under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Education and Labor. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 116-62 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. Section 3 of the rule provides that the following debate, each further amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report, not earlier considered as part of the amendments on block pursuant to Section 4, shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before the question is put thereon, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. Section 4 of the rule provides that at any time after debate, the chair of the Committee on Education and Labor or his designee may offer amendments on block consisting of further amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report not earlier disposed of. Amendments on block shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Education and Labor or their designees, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report and amendments on block described in Section 4. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. The rule provides for consideration of HR 2694, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Education and Labor. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Education and Labor, now printed in the bill, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. The rule provides for consideration of House Resolution 908 condemning all forms of anti-Asian sentiment as related to COVID-19 under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the resolution. The rule provides that the resolutions shall be considered as read. Finally, the rule amends House Resolution 967 agreed to May 15, 2020, as amended by House Resolution 1053 agreed to July 20, 2020, in Section 4 by striking September 21st, 2020, and inserting November 20th, 2020. In Section 11 by striking calendar day of September 20th, 2020, and inserting legislative day of November 20th, 2020. In Section 12 by striking September 21st, 2020, and inserting November 20th, 2020. Thank you.
You've heard the motion from the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Are there any amendments or discussion? Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to begin by thanking you for making the amendment we requested to HR 908 in order. That was a very generous gesture. I think that'll help us get a really strong bipartisan vote, regardless of what happens to the amendment for the bill, simply because you did that. And in the spirit of trying to work with my good friends, we're only going to offer a single amendment today. We think we're a lot closer to agreement on some of these things than people might think. There's at least two of these I think are going to get very strong bipartisan votes of the four. So we'd like an open rule, because I think there are a couple of things that could actually bring us together on one or two of these others. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would offer as an amendment a bipartisan, I would offer as an amendment for an open rule to HR 2639, HR 2694, and HR 2574. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You've heard the amendment from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no.
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 In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Chairman, these things are awful tricky in terms of hearing people. So I think, just for the record, we'd probably want to request a roll call on that.
A roll call has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres, Mrs. Torres,
No.
Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter,
No.
Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin,
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon,
Who's doing this?
I have that.
Ms. Scanlon,
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli,
No.
Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala,
No.
Ms. Shalala, no. Ms. Matsui, Mr. Cole,
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall,
Aye.
Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess, Mrs. Lesko,
Aye.
Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman,
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
3 yeas, 7 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments for discussion? Hearing none, the vote is now on the motion from the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I think due to electronic confusion, we'd want a roll call on that as well.
A roll call has been requested. Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the vote.
Mr. Hastings, Mrs. Torres,
Aye.
Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter.
Aye.
Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon.
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli.
Aye.
Mr. Morelli, aye. Ms. Shalala.
Aye.
Ms. Shalala, aye. Ms. Matsui. Mr. Cole.
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall.
No.
Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Lesko.
No.
Mrs. Lesko, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk, report the total.
7 yeas, 3 nays.
And the motion is agreed to, and Ms. Scanlon will handle it for the Democrats.
And Chairman, my good friend, Mr. Woodall, will handle it for the Republicans.
Terrific. And Mr. Woodall will handle it for the Republicans. So without objection, I thank you. First of all, I thank everybody for their participation today, but without objection, the committee is adjourned.